Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving deep into the life and presidency of Jimmy Carter, a figure, who's often overlooked when we talk about American presidents.
Yeah, you're right. He is overlooked. But his story is fascinating.
Really is. So, for this deep dive, we're looking at his Wikipedia article, and, well, I guess our mission is to try and extract some key insights into his impact, going a bit deeper than the typical summaries.
I think what's really interesting about Carter is that his presidency, well, it was marked by some very public struggles, but then his post-presidency is considered like a huge success.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. What stands out to you when we look at his journey to the White House?
Well, his path to the presidency was, for sure, unconventional. I mean, this is a man who went from peanut farmer to state senator, then governor of Georgia, and then, bam, out of nowhere, he wins the 1976 election.
Yeah, it's true. He wasn't exactly a household name back then. In fact, our source even mentions that some of his opponents were asking Jimmy who during the campaign.
Exactly. And Carter, well, he used that to his advantage, really. He positioned himself as like the outsider, the candidate untainted by Washington, D.C. scandals and all that. He even published a memoir titled Why Not the Best, which was, well, a pretty clever way to introduce himself and address his lack of name recognition all at once.
It does seem like a pretty bold move to own that outsider status so directly,
Yeah.
especially given how much emphasis is placed on experience in these elections, right?
Oh, for sure. It was a gamble, but it worked. Carter was able to tap into like this national mood, a disillusionment with the political establishment, especially after Watergate. People wanted something different, someone they felt they could trust. And Carter's, down-to-earth demeanor and focus on honesty, integrity, that really connected.
Yeah, makes sense. The outline also mentions that his campaign strategy was incredibly intense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He visited something like 37 states, delivered over 200 speeches, and that was before other candidates had even started campaigning.
200 speeches, that's wild.
He had a tireless work ethic and a very targeted approach, too. He knew he couldn't win by appealing to just one group, so he really tailored his message. Like
Right.
in the South, he appealed to moderate voters, those who were, disillusioned with George Wallace and his segregationist policies. And then in the North, he connected with more conservative Christians and rural voters.
So he was building coalitions,
Okay.
appealing to all these different interests. It makes you wonder how much the media played a role in all this,
Yeah.
like in shaping his image and introducing him to everyone.
Right. The media was crucial. This was, when television was becoming so influential. And Carter, he got a lot of positive coverage. He was seen as this fresh face, a symbol of hope, of change, and the media really helped amplify that message.
That's a good point. It highlights how media narratives can have such a big impact on elections, even if those narratives are, sometimes constructed by the media itself. Okay, so Carter wins this surprise victory. What happens next?
Well, immediately he makes some bold moves. On his second day in office, he pardons all Vietnam War draft evaders, which was a pretty controversial decision at the time, showed his commitment to healing the divisions from the war.
Wow, that's sending a clear message about his priorities. What other firsts do we see during his time in office?
Well, he created two new cabinet-level departments, the Department of Energy and the Department of Education. Both really significant moves, showed his focus on modern challenges.
Creating new departments. I mean, that suggests he was serious about modernizing the government,
Hmm.
tackling these issues head on. It also makes it even more surprising that he's the only president to serve a full term without appointing a Supreme Court justice.
It's true. It shows just how much the political landscape has shifted. Today, Supreme Court appointments are these massive political battles. But during Carter's time, it just wasn't as big of a focus.
Huh. It's fascinating to consider how different things shape presidential legacies. Speaking of legacies, one of Carter's most impactful domestic policy decisions was the Chrysler bailout. Can you remind our listener why this bailout was such a big deal?
All right, imagine this. It's the late 1970s, and Chrysler, one of the big three automakers, is about to collapse. They were projecting a loss of $1 billion. A billion, that was a staggering amount back then.
$1 billion loss. Wow, what would happen if they actually went bankrupt?
It would have been a disaster for the economy. Thousands of jobs lost, not just at Chrysler, but throughout the whole auto industry. The effects would have rippled throughout the entire U.S. economy.
So Carter was facing this potential economic catastrophe. What'd he do?
He decided to intervene, worked with Congress to give Chrysler loan guarantees, totaling $3.5 billion. These guarantees, along with Chrysler's own efforts, helped them avoid bankruptcy and save all those jobs.
That was a risky move, though, wasn't it? I mean, government intervention in the free market is always controversial.
Oh, it was definitely a gamble, and there was a lot of debate. Some argued it was necessary to prevent a bigger crisis, while others said it was government overreach, a bailout for a failing company. But in the end, it's generally seen as a success. Chrysler repaid the loans and got back on its feet.
I think this is a good point for our listener to pause and reflect. What do you think about Carter's decision? Was it the right call? Or would a hands-off approach have been better? There are good arguments to be made on both sides.
It's a question that gets to the heart of the role of government in the economy. There are no easy answers. Often comes down to weighing different values and priorities.
All right, let's shift gears a bit, from domestic challenges to the global stage. Carter's presidency was also marked by some big foreign policy achievements and, well, crises. We'll get into those next.
When we talk about Carter on the world stage, I mean, we got to talk about the Camp David Accords.
Right.
It was like a high-stakes gamble, but it paid off.
Okay, yeah. For our listener who might not be totally familiar, can you set the scene for us?
Okay, so picture this. It's 1978, and tensions between Israel and Egypt are, well, they're at a boiling point. Decades of conflict, mistrust, you name it. No one really trusts each other. But Carter, he sees an opportunity, right? He invites Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin to Camp David for 13 days of intense negotiations.
13 days. That's a long time to be, locked in a room with people you disagree with so strongly.
Oh, it was. And it really showed Carter's persistence, his belief in diplomacy. He was going back and forth between the two leaders, constantly trying to find some kind of common ground. And amazingly, it worked.
It did. So what was the outcome of all that after those grueling 13 days?
Well, they signed a peace treaty, a historic peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. Egypt formally recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. It was a huge moment for the whole Middle East, really, and it earned Carter a Nobel Peace Prize later on in 2002.
Wow. It's really interesting how Carter's approach to diplomacy seems to be all about taking these risks, engaging
Right.
with leaders who are considered adversaries. But of course, not all of his efforts were so successful. Our outline mentions the Iran hostage crisis, which was, well, a pretty dark chapter.
Oh, that was a dark time for America. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They took 52 Americans hostage, diplomats, citizens, the whole thing. It was a direct challenge to America, on the world stage.
It was. So what led to this sudden escalation with Iran?
Well, a lot of things, really. The Iranian Revolution had just happened. They overthrew the Shah, who, was backed by the U.S. So a new Islamic Republic was in charge, led by Ayatollah Khomeini. And anti-American sentiment was really high. Years of resentment, interference, it all kind of boiled over. Then Carter allowed the Shah to the U.S. for medical treatment, and, well, that just made things worse.
So the hostage crisis became this symbol of like this really complicated relationship between the U.S. and Iran, all this history, this struggle for power.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it became the defining event of Carter's presidency, really. The hostages were held for 444 days, over a year. It was on the news every night. Those images of the hostages blindfolded, paraded around. It stuck with America.
Yeah, I can imagine. It must have been a huge blow to public trust in Carter's leadership. And the pressure to get those hostages back must have been immense.
Oh, absolutely. Carter tried everything, negotiations, even a military rescue mission, which tragically failed. The hostage crisis became a symbol of American weakness, and it definitely played a role in his election loss in 1980.
It's a reminder that, well, even the best plans can fail, especially in foreign policy. But even as this was unfolding, there was another major event brewing, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah, that one. December 1979. Sent shockwaves, I tell you. Carter saw it as aggression, a threat to global stability. The whole balance of power during the Cold War was at stake.
Right, the Cold War. So how did this invasion play into those tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union?
Well, it changed everything. It ended détente, which, for our listener, was this period of, reduced tension, more cooperation between the two superpowers.
So this invasion, it just shattered that peace.
It did. Carter responded with sanctions, diplomacy, and military aid to the Afghan resistance. He even boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. A symbolic move, but it showed how serious things were.
Wow. Seems like this invasion had ripple effects everywhere, changing the whole dynamic of the Cold War.
Oh, yeah. It had a huge impact, not just on the Cold War, but on Afghanistan itself. That invasion led to a decade of conflict, devastating for the country and its people, and some say it even contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union.
Wow. So both the Iran hostage crisis and the Soviet invasion, they really loomed over Carter's presidency. And of course, it was all happening as he was facing re-election in 1980.
Yeah, and as we know, he lost to Ronald Reagan. It was a big defeat. And, well, most people attribute it to a few things: the
Yeah.
economy, the hostage crisis, and Reagan's ability to tap into this feeling of, dissatisfaction. People wanted change.
Yeah, it's interesting how domestic issues and foreign policy can get so intertwined, especially during an election.
Oh, absolutely. One can really influence the other. And for Carter, it was like all these challenges just hit at once, a perfect storm, and he couldn't overcome it.
He couldn't. But even with all that, Carter's story doesn't end there. In fact, some say his most important work began after he left office. Let's talk about that next. We're back, and now we're going to talk about, well, one of the most interesting parts of Carter's story is post-presidency. It's almost like leaving office kind of, unleashed a new level of impact for him.
It really is. A lot of presidents just kind of, fade away after they leave the White House. But Carter, he really embraced it with like this energy and purpose it's really inspiring.
The outline mentions the Carter Center, which he founded. It seems like a key part of this whole next chapter. Can you tell our listener more about it, what they do?
Sure. The Carter Center, it was founded in 1982, and it's all about advancing peace and health around the world. They're a non-governmental organization, so they work on resolving conflicts, promoting democracy, improving health, all that in some really, really tough places.
So it's not just talk. They're actually like out there making a difference on the ground.
Exactly. They're very hands-on, working with communities to address the root causes of conflict and poverty. One of their biggest achievements has been their work to eradicate guinea worm disease. It's a parasitic infection that used to be, well, pretty common in parts of Africa and Asia.
That's a disease I've heard of. But to be honest, I don't know much about it. Why is it so bad? And how did the Carter Center get involved?
Oh, it's a terrible disease. You get it from contaminated water, and the larvae, they grow inside you. And eventually this worm emerges, a long, painful worm. It can cause so much pain, disability. It's awful. So the Carter Center, they saw how devastating it was and launched this global campaign back in the 80s to, well, wipe it out. And they've made incredible progress. Education, working with communities, partnering with governments, all of it.
So they took this disease that was like everywhere, and they're close to getting rid of it completely. That's amazing.
It really is. And it shows what you can do with focus and collaboration. But their work goes way beyond just guinea worm. They've monitored elections and, new democracies. They mediate conflicts, promote agricultural development, all sorts of things.
It sounds like Carter, he took everything he learned from his time as president, the good and the bad, and he applied it to, well, his post-presidency work. Like he found a new way to lead and have an impact.
I think so, yeah. And it's a reminder that leadership, it's not just about having a fancy title. It can be expressed in different ways. And, often the best leaders are the ones who are willing to get their hands dirty, work with others to achieve something together.
He actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for this work, right?
He did, and that really shows, the global respect he's earned. The Nobel Committee recognized his, and I'm quoting here, decades of untiring effort to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts, to advance democracy and human rights, and to promote economic and social development. It's really, it's about his commitment to making the world better, plain and simple.
And it shows that legacies, well, they're complicated, aren't they? They can change over time. For Carter, all these post-presidency achievements have kind of, in some ways, overshadowed the struggles he had in office.
For sure. It's interesting, isn't it, how we judge a presidency? Do we just look at those 4 or 8 years? Or do we take a longer view, look at the impact both during and after their time in office?
It's a great question. And it makes me think about how Carter's story challenges our idea of, well, success and failure. This is a man who, despite all the setbacks, the disappointments, he achieved this level of global recognition, respect that, well, most presidents haven't.
Right. It's a reminder that being a leader, it's not about never failing. It's about learning from those failures, persevering, and using those experiences to make a difference.
And Carter's been active for so long. Into his 90s, writing books, giving speeches, advocating for all sorts of things. He even published a book in 2006, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, which which caused quite a bit of controversy with its criticism of Israel's policies.
Oh, yeah, that book sparked a lot of debate. But it also showed Carter's willingness to, speak truth to power, even on really divisive issues. He wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo or fight for justice, even if it meant getting criticized.
Yeah, speaks volumes about his authenticity, his integrity. He's always stuck to his values, and he's never been afraid to stand up for what he believes in, popular or not.
Yeah, I agree. That commitment to principle is something people admire, even those who disagree with him. He's a man of deep conviction, and he's lived his life that way.
Okay, well, as we wrap up this deep dive into Jimmy Carter, what's the one thing you want our listener to remember? What's the core of his story?
I think at its heart, Carter's story tells us that leadership is a journey. It's not about reaching some specific destination. It's about the challenges, the mistakes, the never giving up on making the world better.
And it's about realizing that success, true success, isn't always about what happens right away. It's about the long-term impact we have on the world, on other people. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Jimmy Carter. We hope you learned something new about this, well, complex and fascinating man.
It was great to be here with you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.